My name's Councillor Will Pascal, and I'm the Chairman of the Environment Select Committee. I'd like to welcome everybody to tonight's session organised by the Select Committee. Please note that we're live streaming this event on the Council's YouTube channel, so it can be watched either now or it can be watched at any time thereafterwards. This evening's speaker is Andrew Boff, who is Chair of the London Assembly and Chair of the Planning and Regeneration Committee in Assembly. The committee recently completed an inquiry into COVID-19 housing typologies and design in London and looked at the environmental and social impacts of different housing typologies, including tall buildings and dense situations, the costs of tall buildings, the viability and affordable housing provision, how things work in a dense housing situation, and the dependence on quality of design and management. This is not a formal select committee, and therefore permitted to do this over the web, but a session to allow Andrew to discuss and inform us of the inquiry's findings in more detail. We'll also be having question and answer with Andrew afterwards. So I would now, a great pleasure to hand over to Andrew, who will give his presentation about his committee's inquiry. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chair, and I'm delighted to be here. I'm delighted because you've shown an interest in a piece of work that I think is quite significant in terms of the future development of London. If I can just briefly explain who the London Assembly are, we are a body of 25 members, cross-party, elected at the same time as the Mayor in order to hold the Mayor to account. I chair the Planning and Regeneration Committee, and we have been concerned for some time at the number of residential towers that are being built in London, and sometimes the inability, it appears, of local councillors to be able to challenge those developments. Well, we've all been in the situation, I think. If anybody who's sat on a planning committee, you see a plan you don't like, and the officers tell you can't reject it. And therefore you're presented with that dilemma of either accepting what you know is a bad plan or it going to appeal and the plan and the development suddenly being worse than the one that you'd turned down. So this was, throughout London, I've talked to people, councillors from all parties, about this frustration that local councillors have of controlling their built environment. You know, as an assembly, our job is to hold the Mayor to account, and of course the Mayor is critical with regard to how London looks in the future. He is the one that's responsible for the London plan, and the London plan, or rather local plans, have to be in general conformity with the London plan, and I understand at the moment you are developing your plan, and this, I hope very much that this piece of evidence will feed into that. We started our analysis of the building typologies in London by calling on experts. So what I say tonight, unless I tell you otherwise, is not my opinion. It is the evidence given by experts in the field. That's both architects, developers, and people with a very strong interest in housing. We heard from, for example, and our meeting was convened on the 21st of October 2020, and we heard evidence from a range of experts from UCL, architectural practices, and indeed local authorities themselves to talk about the challenges. The main output from this investigation that we covered was the committee's response to the Good Quality Homes for Londoners supplementary planning guidance consultation. The Mayor's planning team hopes that this guidance will supplement a number of the London plan policies and ensure that land is used in the best way possible to deliver good quality homes, the good quality homes that Londoners so desperately need. And there is no difference between, across any kind of political divide, that we need more homes in London. We absolutely do. But It's what kind of homes best meet the requirements of the growing population of London. We also wrote to every single councillor. It's something we've not done before, because we realise that these issues are faced day to day by not just planning committee members, but also those members who are trying to represent their residents when it comes to challenging or holding to account the developers. As a brief summary, because I could go on for hours on this subject, I won't, but so I'm going to read through a summary, if I may, of what the results of our investigation were. We know that London needs more homes, and London's most recent strategic housing market assessment in 2017 showed that the city may need around 66,000 new homes a year to provide enough homes for current and future Londoners. And we know that the density has to increase. If you don't live in Holland, you have no option for increasing the amount of land you have available to you. And so we know that density must increase in order to accommodate the high demand. There are many studies that illustrate how high-density schemes can provide really good quality, attractive housing, and ensure the most efficient use of land. Others advocate the creation of more and better urban homes with terraced streets of houses and apartments rather than complex multi-storey buildings. While there are multiple typologies that can increase density, the committee has a long-standing interest in tall buildings and the effect that they have on residents. The committee has raised concerns that the new London plan does not provide adequate guidance in this respect to ensure that tall buildings are appropriate to their location and surroundings. This is particularly important as in 2020 there were 525 tall buildings over 20 stories in the pipeline in various stages of planning and development. I'll leave that figure with you, 525. Residential requirements are seen as the key driver for building tall. So we're not just talking about corporate headquarters in the City of London. We're talking about places where people want to live. Of the 60 completions at that time, 88% of those tall buildings were residential. So we think there needs to be planning guidance that is specific to residential tall buildings as opposed to commercial and mixed use. And we've been advocating to the Mayor on this issue. The guidance should include consideration of dwelling typologies, size mix and space standards, tenure mix and amenity space. These are all important issues. Because, as we well know, if a child is starved of places to play, that will have an effect on their future development. And so many of these tower blocks have inadequate access to areas for play or green areas. There's growing evidence base that demonstrating that tall buildings are less sustainable for those which provide a similar quantum of development in other configurations. And at a time when we're considering London's approach to the climate crisis, this is a very important issue. The taller the building, and these are all facts given to us by developers and people in the housing field. The taller the building, the more energy that goes into construction. There are higher amounts of embodied energy, that is the energy with which we build those buildings, required per usable square metre, much more as low carbon materials such as timber are not viable. Energy use is higher in tall buildings, with electricity use twice as high due to the conditions that prevail at higher altitudes. including more exposure to sun and wind. Tall buildings also suffer more from heat loss for the same amount of insulation as lower buildings because of the higher wind speeds around that block. Professor Philip Stedman told us about a study conducted by UCL a couple of years ago into tall office buildings, mostly in London, which found that the increase in building height from 6 stories to 20 stories doubles the electricity use per square metre. We think that the whole life cycle impact of tall buildings and the embodied and operational carbon footprint should be given more attention, not just by the mayor, but local authorities as well. The whole life cycle impact should include the carbon emissions from extraction, processing, and the transport of materials to the site, as well as the additional emissions from construction, and indeed the energy from plant and waste and relevant issues post-completion, such as maintenance, refurbishment, demolition, and disposal. Now, often we've been sold the logic that the reason we build so high is to save money. And during the committee investigation, we heard about the relationship between high building density and building and maintenance cost, including how the whole life cycle costs of buildings are not always fully considered at the development stage. That they are, and that servicing tall buildings can be costly, and this often results in much higher service charges to those residents. So the cost to the developer possibly cheaper, but the cost to the residents much, much more. We heard about how how research that was commissioned by the London Borough of Tower Hamlets into tall buildings, and London, Tower Hamlets knows its tower blocks, found that the maintenance and management of buildings, and I looked into how these buildings operate as a system. It's an important design issue that needs to be addressed for good quality outcomes. For example, ongoing maintenance and servicing needs to be planned for to ensure that the system of a tall building is run well. Seemingly mundane things such as having appropriate functioning space for caretaking may be overlooked. Yet this is absolutely vital for tall buildings in particular. Poorly designed systems for caretaking from waste, energy to water management could potentially undermine other objectives such as carbon reduction, but also result in a poor service to residents. The committee thinks the practicalities and costs associated with tall buildings, including long-term and lifetime costs, should be carefully considered in the development process. And these are the kind of questions that councillors sitting on planning committees and those with an interest in those planning committees, councillors who perhaps representing their electorates, need to take into account and need to challenge the developer on. With regard to affordable housing and family homes, the economics of tall buildings suggest that new high-rise developments are usually high value, with very, very few affordable options. They have high management costs and service charges, and that often precludes people who are on affordable tenures. Well-designed family homes are also harder to achieve. Tall buildings tend to contain a majority of mainly studio and one-bed flats, and a proportion of two-bedroom flats. These flats are also remote from the shared amenity space, reducing opportunities for children to play and socialise. We heard that a high-density, medium to low-rise model can work more easily for families enabling communal or individual gardens at lower stories that are closer to the individual families than tall buildings allow. And as an aside, I was challenging a tower block in the borough in which I live, which is Barking and Dagenham. And there the developers said, of course, there's lots of play space. But in order to access that play space, children will need to go down in the lift, across a courtyard, up in another lift, because the play space was on the roof of another building. That's not accessible play space. The committee, as I said, the committee thinks that the practicalities and costs associated with tall buildings, including lifetime and long-term and lifetime costs, should not just be considered at development proposal stage. It should be certainly considered by local authorities themselves. We are sold the image of tall buildings being the solution to London's housing problems, and quite frankly, they're not. Now, we heard that where planning for tall buildings goes ahead, good design of communal spaces can support children's independent mobility and informal play. And we actually want to see more examples of where this has been done well across all types of housing. We as a committee also want to see increased recognition of the challenges that different building types may pose. And of course, the other disadvantage of being clever with some of these plans of sticking the play space on the roof is that that presents problems with supervision and the microclimates that these large buildings create for that, on that play space. Our panel highlighted the importance of good design. Matthew Carmona from UCL told us about the research which showed that the newer the home, the less comfortable it was found to be. Those in social housing tended to be less comfortable than those in privately owned or rented homes. And also, the higher you were from the ground, the less comfortable you were in terms of your living environment and the happiness in your neighbourhood. It is essential that tall buildings embody good quality design if they go ahead at all. For example, we heard about the importance of amenity space being directly connected to living space and being big enough, robust, and have the right outlook and orientation. And, of course, the acoustic privacy between and within homes. I don't know about you, but I, years ago, moved into a flat that did not have acoustic privacy between the homes, and my neighbour was an amateur drummer. This also links to what we have seen during the pandemic. While some of our panel cautioned against making knee-jerk changes to planning policy, and I reflect both sides of this argument, in response to the pandemic, we think that the pandemic and the lockdowns that resulted have highlighted the critical importance of access to green space, private outdoor space, outdoor play space, and the adaptability of those buildings needed for home working. Given all the concerns I have discussed, the committee is of the view, this is the cross-party bit, I'll go on to my opinion a little bit later, but given all concerns that have been discussed, the committee is of the view that tall buildings are not the answer to London's housing needs and should not be encouraged outside of a few designated and carefully managed areas. Proposals for tall buildings should be required to demonstrate that other building configurations which would achieve similar densities have been considered. Now, whatever the outcome from tonight, we would be only too happy to share any more information that you have, to find information on our website, and we're more than happy to provide contact details if you want to get in touch. But I'm now addressing, if I can, people all the councillors here will know what it's like to knock on a door and ask people what they're thinking. And through my many years of conducting that practice, I can say that I do not consider that the kind of social deprivation, the kind of lack of opportunities, the kind of lack of choice that people have through this fashion of providing tower blocks as a solution to London's housing crisis, it's not a solution at all. If anything, we are building up problems for the future. We are handing to residents, whether or not they're owner-occupiers or leaseholders. Actually, we didn't touch on leasehold because, of course, the kind of problems and complexity residents will have as a result of that leasehold model that's rapidly, may I say, going out of fashion, but nobody seems to be doing much about it. That complexity, that difficulty, that inability to control future costs is something that residents really don't appreciate. And in arguing this case across London, I must say that I've referred to the Royal Borough on many, many occasions. Because people will often say, you know, it's the only solution to achieve the density and the numbers of homes that the government has handed down to us in terms of what London should be building. And it's the only way to do it. And as I often say to people, look, what is the most sought after address in the whole of London? Which borough is that? And it's the Royal Borough, Kensington and Chelsea. And you have so few tower blocks. You've accommodated a very high density with a collection of news houses, terrace properties, and wonderful mansion blocks that everybody loves. The people who live there love them. It's a delight to come home to. The options we are offering people with this obsession with tall buildings are not options at all. There's been a study years ago, which I'm going to have to reference now. I will find the reference. There was a study that, I think it was Create Streets conducted this study, and that looked at that they did a poll of people who were on housing waiting lists or in housing need, and they gave them a number of options of what kind of home that they want to live in. And a lot, you would assume such an open question would say, I just want a semi-detached home with a drive for 5 cars. No, they didn't. People are actually responsible if you ask them. And overwhelmingly, the choice in that survey was the people wanting to live in a home with a back garden out the back and a front door that opened out onto the street. That was the aspiration for those in housing need. But when the only option, and especially if you're in affordable housing, like if you're on a council waiting list, you don't get much of a choice. You don't get much of a choice. And if it's a choice between living in temporary overcrowded accommodation and a flat that's on the 14th floor of a tower block, you're going to choose the option that's made available to you. There are so few other options, and yet throughout London, we have seen wonderful examples of how the vernacular style, for example, from the Royal Borough, has been built and has made people happy and has helped to resolve London's housing problems. So if I can just come back to where I started, and it's not been the hour, I'm really looking forward to some questions. If I can come back to where I started, we want to empower councillors to be able to make the decisions that are in the interests of their residents. We don't want to see a situation where planning applications become a fait accompli, and where councillors' inputs become marginal to the decision. We want to be able to see residents really having a say about what their localities look like, really being able to engage and being able to have councillors who vote the way that they, in the interests of their residents. And too many councillors have said to me, we're just told we can't do that because the professional officers say there's not enough reasons. There's not, and the professional officers themselves, many of whom are really good officers, they're bound by the regulations as well as it is. And if you can't provide the reasons to reject an application, you know that you're heading for an appeal. Our attempt here is not to tell you what to build, and we're not telling Londoners, we don't want to tell Londoners what to build. That's down to yourselves as to how you feel. And I've been acquainted with some of the proposals that you have about how you manage, are intending to manage the height of buildings in the Royal Borough. And we want to empower you to work, to get that to happen. Personally, not speaking as the chair of the planning committee, I loathe every single one of the residential towers. It's lovely if you've got the penthouse. It's absolutely wonderful, and we all want that. And it's initially lovely for those singletons or people starting off on life who want a small accommodation, and I often get attacked for being a NIMBY and not providing those kind of homes that those particular people want. Well, that's really not the case. I want to see more homes built in London. I want to see larger homes built in London, and I want to see us addressing this housing crisis. We are not doing it by just going through that 1960s, 70s solution of the government handing down a target and the local authorities just building whatever in order to hit that number. I have other suggestions as well about how we can do that. So I know it hasn't been an hour, Chair, but this is an area that I'm pretty sure many people have opinions on, and please do ask me for information, and we'll be only too happy to provide you both with the transcripts and the minutes of those investigations that we did, and also to assist you in any way we can, because we have common cause. We want to see London a better place, and we want to solve the housing crisis, but we don't want to go back to the 60s. Thank you very much.
First of all, Andrew, thank you very much for introducing this subject for us tonight. Secondly, just to emphasize, this is not a decision-making meeting, and that's why we're allowed to live stream it, and hopefully people who are on the live stream are enjoying the event as well, and also those who will be watching it on subsequent days, because it will remain on the website. If people have any inquiries after this meeting that they wish a substantial answer to, if they could address the inquiries to me by email with a copy to James Diamond, who's sitting to my right, your left, on that side, who's support officer on policy in environment scrutiny. So it's just James Diamond at rbkc.gov.uk for those who are not familiar. And we'll try to come back to you or relay the inquiry to Andrew or whoever he suggests is the source, because we've heard of several sources like UCL, various architectural practices and professionals in the talk tonight. The message initially that I get is primarily that it's not a one-size-fits-all situation, and the detail and context and how it's carried out and the quality of design and management and sufficient budgets are absolutely essential to get tall buildings to work well, as they do in some circumstances, and they have worked well in other parts of the world in some circumstances. I personally have seen extremely well-managed buildings in Hong Kong, for instance, where they're well familiar with tall buildings, since they nearly all are. And I've seen some in Hong Kong which really don't work. And the difference was that the first group were well-managed, private sector, high-budget tower blocks, and the second category were largely public or housing for poorer people where there was not sufficient budgets. And for people who say that it all works well in Hong Kong, so we shouldn't have any problems, it's not the case. It works well there in some places and not well in other cases. So both all around the world there are examples of good and bad. And the purpose tonight is for us to get the maximum information. So let me ask two questions, if I may, who have come in from Malcolm Spalding, one of our councillors. He's asked, firstly, are there any stats with regards to resident satisfaction from different sources? I think you did mention that you've done some survey work, so being pointed in the direction of that by James Diamond will help facilitate, would be good. And the second thing is there any medical data, both physical and mental health data, coming out of experience of living in tower blocks, and perhaps most topically during the pandemic that you mentioned just now? So if there is any recent data, that would be useful. Thank you.
Yes, the report I alluded to, it wasn't Create Streets. Create Streets used this report. It was the Place Alliance's Home Comforts report published in October 2020, and that surveyed 2,500 households. And just to recap, that revealed that the higher you got off the ground, the less comfortable you were in terms of your living environment and your happiness with the neighbourhood. I think the problem with the problem, Councillor Spalding, has been is that not enough work was done early enough to collect all the data that we need. Pretty much everyone had been sold on the idea that tall buildings were the thing to do. It was a very technocratic idea, and it was rather wonderful and solved all London's problems. And there are so many examples in London of where, just anecdotally, you know that's not the case. With regard to the well-managed buildings, absolutely, management makes a real difference. And I'll give you a couple of anecdotes. First was, I used to be the local councillor in Hackney, which was part of the old Holly Street estate. And I had pretty poor view of tower blocks then. And they knocked down the Holly Street estate of tower blocks and generally a concrete jungle that was ridden by crime. And they built some rather nice buildings, but they did leave one tower block, 333 Queensbridge Road it's called. They left one tower block, but what they did very intelligently, I may say, because just knocking things down for the sake of knocking things down is not always a good idea. But what they intelligently said is, what we're going to do is we're going to have this with a concierge service, and we're going to restrict it to those who are over the age of 50, which takes, for those of us who know, the majority of antisocial behaviour tends to come from those under 50, shall we say. And so that effectively it was a well-managed building, and you knew it was well-managed because the residents who I met up with on a regular occasion used to moan about each other rather than the council, and that's always a good test, isn't it, that things are running okay. Well, that worked all very well with that high management cost. And then Hackney Council decided it needed to save money, and so the concierge service became peripatetic and less supervision of the building. And of course, with the housing crisis that we do have, Hackney had some desperate cases on their waiting list, and they changed the policy. They changed the policy and started to accommodate families. I want good accommodation for families, but we've got to realise that sometimes putting families against next to elderly people where the only play space is the stairwell is not the best solution to harmony. And so that design in itself started to be fall to pieces. And the other anecdote I've got is that when we were building stuff on the Millennium Park in Greenwich, and there I still maintain my view that high-rise, high density was not a good idea. And so I went over to, and I was told, no, by the developers, no, this is fine. This is a different kind of development, and we will have mixed tenure, high-rise buildings, and it will work with communal areas. And I thought, well, fine, I don't always think that what I think is the truth. So I went to look at the evidence, and I went over there and had a look round, And I looked around these very tall blocks standing in the courtyard. It was beautifully maintained with a lovely children's play area in there, and no drug dealers, in the playground. And it was beautifully maintained, and I thought, well, I've been challenged here, and you have got a good scheme. And I said, so which one of these are the social housing tenants? And they said, oh, we haven't got any of them yet. They haven't got any of them yet. So I said, well, fair enough, my position stays. They called me over about a year later to say, we have got a development. Again, it's in the Millennium Village, and it's really nice, and it's lovely, and all the rest of it. So back I went to the Millennium Village, and again I was shown round, and again it was lovely, and it seemed to work. And it looked very good. And while I was there, I thought, well, it's challenged my view. So I went and just randomly knocked on the door, to the horror of the people who were showing me around. I just randomly knocked on the door and started talking to a resident. And I said, is it really nice? And she said, yes, it is really nice. It's a really lovely place to bring up my family. And I said, is there any downside? She said, well, the £350 service charge a month is a bit of a problem. I mean, that is the kind of money that you have to spend in order to make some of these developments work. It's a lot of money, and in terms of costs, not just to the local authority because they're minimum, but the costs to the residents are extreme. And we're talking about people in social housing. There is growing data to support everything I've said, and I'm quite happy to share with you, Councillor Spalding, and the committee all the data and the sources that we have. But there's almost nothing going for tall buildings, may I say. Almost nothing. But I accept that people have a diversity of views. And I note from what you're looking at in Kensington, Chelsea, you're talking about an absolute upper limit of 1.5 times the height of the buildings around. And I think personally, I think that's a great step from the evidence we received. In, for example, other cities like San Francisco, there's a general limit on the height of those buildings of 12 metres or 4 to 5 stories. The height limit is driving developers to find more ingenious ways of achieving high density rather than tall buildings, according to the evidence we've received. If you talk to developers, they're going to develop whatever you tell them, whatever the limits are that you allow them. Asking the opinion of a developer on what they should build is the worst mistake that we ever make. We should say what it is that's as local authority. I'd say we, but yourselves as local authorities. You're the ones who set your local plan, and they should build to that envelope. And so, looking at your proposals, they seem to be pushing in the right direction for your borough. But I don't live here, so my opinion, I'd feel more confident if this was a Barking and Dagenham scrutiny session and I could give my opinion, but that's entirely up to you. But it seems to be taking up good practice from across the world.
Can I just mention observation by Councillor Doris Smetling, who's I'm receiving some WhatsApps and texts questions. He's pointed out that we have a group of tenants in Trellick Tower, for instance, who are by and large, in his opinion, very satisfied with living in their building. I don't know whether, Kim Taylor-Smith, you have any survey data with regard to Trellick as to whether people are happy living there. But if that's the case, it must be that we've got example within the borough that Doris Smetling's mentioned where people are happy living there in tall building. I think we've also got two questions from Quentin Marshall, Councillor Quentin Marshall. The first question is, do you, Andrew, think that the Mayor of London will listen to your committee's report and advice? And second thing, do you think that the evidence from KNC with regard to mansion blocks and medium rise actually achieves the densities required by the London plan?
let's go to Trellick Tower first of all. Back in 1976, yeah, I was 2 years old. No, that's not true. I was well acquainted with Trellick Tower because I did a research project at the tender age of whatever I was about Trellick Tower. And the thing is, Trellick Tower, yes, is working now, but what's the journey been like over all these years to get it to where it is? Because certainly the first time I went to Trellick Tower, it wasn't a well-managed place. It wasn't a good place for environment to bring up children. I know fantastic advances have been made, but why are we doing this to ourselves? Why are we creating problems for the future? Why are we creating this huge management headache when we know that not far from Trellick Tower are the kind of typology of buildings that are sought after by virtually everybody who wants a home in London, because they're beautiful, they're charming, those terraced houses, the mansion blocks, and they are well sought after, and they make London look a nicer place, to be honest. Will we be listened to? Well, ultimately, this is a cross-party investigation. So everything I said up to where I probably parted and started to tell you what I think is the opinion of all groups, and the Assembly is made up of Labour, Conservative, Green and Liberal Democrat members. And I would not be here unless I had the consent and permission of the Assembly to do so. He has to listen, because he realizes, I think, that this typology is not popular. And there are, as I say, there are so many examples of modern developments around London, and I could take you by the hand and show you, not necessarily building, for example, the exact vernacular of the Royal Borough, but if you go to other boroughs, for instance, the London Borough of Sutton, you look at very modern interpretation of that kind of aspiration. If you go to Bedshead, which it's an absolute marvellous development, it looks like it's a spaceship, but actually it's actually a collection of properties with doors that open out onto the street and easily accessible green areas with a very high density. And that's the sort of challenge I'd like to throw down to architects, and many have accepted, is to come up with typologies of buildings that people want to live in, not the ones that they have to because there are no other choices. I'm sorry, I missed the evidence of...
The second question, part of that question was as to whether the evidence that you've collected and your knowledge of the examples of mansion blocks and so on in K&C, will they achieve the densities that are needed under the London Plan in your view?
Well, I think that kind of segue into that, because yes, it will. Yes, they will. Well, first of all, if you look at the aspirations that the government has, which is then reflected in the London Plan, I don't think there's a year that's ever gone by where we've hit those targets. In knowledge, I'm looking at Stephen Green, my researcher, and I don't think there is a single year when those targets have been hit in London. They're ridiculously high. And this is an example of the top-down nature of government that we've had. No criticism of any particular party, because it's been going on for generations, of where, well, perhaps generations is over-egging it, but whereby the central government sets the target of how many homes they need, and then that filters down to all the local authorities. And unfortunately, I don't think that those figures really pay much attention to what is possible. What mansion blocks and cleverly designed developments can do is go a long way to meeting those targets. But also what is on record, and I'm trying to remember the source, but I'm pretty sure that there has been a study to show that just building tower blocks is not going to meet our targets. We are not, even if every street corner had a 20-story tower block, you're still not going to meet those targets, because a lot of the developments that are taking place are in, that are taking place are in small sites. There are a lot of developments which big developers are not interested in and aren't suitable to tall developments. They're actually going on at the moment, and that's where we're going to try and get towards that target. I do have a view about this top-down aspect of government, but I'm just one of the foot soldiers in this respect.
There's a particular article that I noticed in the last couple of days come around from the Kensington Society, and you're here as well, so perhaps you'd like to follow up on this with a question. Henry Peterson wrote an article in that issue which recaps some of the current planning applications that are around and recent permissions, and the developments to the northwest of the borough have been given permissions up to 55 stories recently. So maybe, Michael Barr, could you follow up that theme with a question, since it's from your society?
Yes, well, first of all, I should say there are some things I want to say which are not necessarily related to the Kensington Society's activities, because I've been presenting to...
Can you move a little nearer the microphone?
I've been presenting to the Planning and Regeneration Committee on densities, high buildings, mayoral call-in, are all issues where successive mayors have pressed through tall buildings. And the reason that we've reached the stage of having probably up to about 550 now tall buildings in the pipeline is because a combination of opportunity areas, policies which have actually pursued tall buildings, that we've got to that position. What you haven't mentioned is that there has been a complete about turn. Previously it was the London plan which said where to put tall buildings, and opportunity areas in particular were chosen, despite the fact that many of them don't have very good public transport or any other facilities. And North Acton and places like that are very much come out of that, and you only have to look at Vauxhall Nine Elms is the extreme perhaps. Although I have to say the area immediately north of Westfield, which I saw today at close quarters, is horrific. Now the big change that's taken place, and not that the mayor has actually bought the idea that tall buildings are not such a good thing, he's actually delegated the responsibility for tall buildings from the London plan to local plans. There's only one snag in this. There is a hiatus between the adoption of a very good policy in the London plan and a 2 or 3 year wait before the boroughs have actually got the policies to take advantage of that. Because the policy says each of the boroughs have got to identify the locations and the heights of buildings where tall buildings are appropriate. And then it says, and those are the only locations in which tall buildings will be allowed. Now you don't get to use that last bit until you've done the first bit, which is to put your locations and heights in your plan. Now this borough looked at it in 2010 in terms of the appropriate sites, for, well, more focused on the inappropriate sites, which are largely the conservation areas, listed buildings, things like that. But we're starting from scratch in our new local plan, and we don't have to accept lots of tall buildings. And the rumours about the numbers coming down from the centre, they're not as bad as we thought they were going to be. They've got, I can't say better, but the London plan is still the plan for London for the time being. So our target is 488 a year, so 448 a year, rather than the 3,247 that was first thought of by the government. So we have a problem now that we've got to get a clear policy for tall buildings as soon as possible, but we can't really operate it until it's been through examination. At that point, all those other sites which are not suitable for tall buildings will be inappropriate locations. So we have a problem that in the next 2 or 3 years, people could still come forward with tall buildings proposals. Now, the Society has actually fought a number of the tall buildings in the borough. Successes with Kensington Forum Hotel, which went through 2 mayoral hearings and eventually was called in by the Secretary of State, and the developer pulled out. But it was a hotel, not a housing scheme. But there are quite a lot still in the pipeline. There's the Cromwell Road site near the boundary with Hammersmith, which is a threat because there's 29-storey buildings and some other tall buildings. But we've been relatively fortunate that unlike Hammersmith and Fulham, where the previous administration was gung-ho for growth, which is why we've got Old Oak Common Development Corporation, we are being surrounded by, as the article that you referred to, Will, by tall buildings in Hammersmith and Fulham, both in the north and in the south. And on the other side, of course, we've got Vauxhall Nine Elms.
Okay, thank you, Michael. Andrew, would you like to have your response to that? And then I'd like to go to Kim Taylor-Smith.
Michael's an expert on planning, as we all know, and many times he's given us evidence to the Planning and Regeneration Committee on a whole range of issues, and it's been really important, your input, may I say. I think that's right about the change in the London plan. However, we have been here before. Back in the early 2000s, the Mayor of London at the time had a similar policy, which he basically instructed boroughs to go and identify areas where tall buildings would be acceptable. And I particularly remember the response from the London Borough of Richmond, which was nowhere. And that carried through. So there is a danger from neighbouring boroughs, which is why I'm on a bit of a mission, really, and I hope that that those links that other people may have to councillors around the Royal Borough, if you can just get them to read our letter, it will gear them up. As I say, this is cross-party frustration. It will gear them up to be able to challenge some of these taller buildings. As to whether or not one could use the aspiration of the Royal Borough to reject an application, I think that's the kind of thing that keeps planning lawyers in Shabley. I think they are. It will be something to be challenged in inquiries. There is what's good about the good bits about the London plan are that it does specify, first of all, that the boroughs should come up with their own plans, and that's a positive contribution, may I say, a huge positive contribution. It also defines what a tall building is, because if up till the London plan people had their own opinions about what tall building was, we now know it's 6 stories, and that's the classification. So again, these are things that councillors can use in committee and in representing their residents in order to come up with good cases for challenging these decisions. And once again, I'm not telling you to fight every single one. It's your borough. It's your choices. It's just that throughout the boroughs and the people I've talked to, this is common amongst councillors in all boroughs and from all parties.
Thank you very much. Kim Taylor-Smith, who's our Deputy Leader and also leads the Housing Initiative.
Thank you, very interesting. So first of all, can I just agree with what Michael said about tall buildings, is that tall buildings in appropriate places are not bad things. I've just been up to Trellick this afternoon, and I spend a lot of time at Trellick Tower at the moment because has in front of it the second largest site that this borough owns, and we have an acute shortage of housing, so we're trying to maximise our housing wherever we are. And I think, Will, you talked about, well, have we done a survey? No, but I can say that 20% of the people who live in Trellick Tower do so by choice, in terms of they're the leaseholders. And what I can also say, and I'm generalising here, is that when I travel around into our social housing buildings and tall buildings and talk to residents, one of the attractions of tall buildings is the view, and that's very much the predominating feel on Trellick Tower. It has got the most magnificent views over London, and those that have bought and moved there have done so, one, because of the attraction of Erno Goldfinger's masterpiece of brutalist architecture, and secondly, because of its location and view. And that is compared to being in a lower rise or mansion block where your view happens to be really of your neighbour across the road. Now, I know if I go to my parents' village and I did a straw poll, everybody there would say, no, of course we don't want to live in a tall building, because they have space. And I think a really interesting issue for us with regard to Trellick has been the recent consultation we've had on building in front of it, which hasn't gone well, and was very unpopular, because I think throughout the borough, if you're building in close proximity to people, generally speaking, they don't like it. And I think the designs there, we really had a debate between the council and the residents on whether or not it was more appropriate to have low-rise mansion block or a development with one large, as in 14-storey, tower, in order to give the numbers. And it was a simple discussion, and what, in terms of well-being and view, the issue with the mansion blocks, low-rise, was it took all the space. Although you had, in reasonable close proximity, meanwhile, gardens, it was also something that our planning department weren't in favour of in terms of building healthy building homes, because of this close proximity where you had, maybe 10, 11 metres between you and your next door neighbour. But a lot of residents actually felt that was better for them. And then the alternative scheme, which is the one that was put forward by the council, was a single 14-storey block with some lower blocks, 6 stories. And the impact of that was, and I think this is the most important aspect for me on tall buildings, is it increased the open space in around Trellick by 60%. And it created a great area of public space that people could use and enjoy. And that is the trade-off. And I think when we talk about tall buildings, for me, I think we should not think about the old-fashioned sense of a tall building, which I think is the sort of thing that I would historically have thought of, which is a big building. I like to think about tall buildings now in terms of modern design, is to where you have permeability on the ground floor. And you don't have to walk around tall buildings. You can walk through and you have animation within those buildings, and you might be entering your residential from about the second or third floor, because the rest of it, as I say, is open space. So I think tall buildings can be very effective, I think, if they're properly designed and incorporate features which I think deal with some of the issues that people might find oppressive of being in a tall building. But I have to say, I don't think I've met a resident who said to me, I don't like living in this tall building because it makes me dizzy, or I'm up too high, or anything like that, etc. And I do think that we have to recognise that within our borough, which is such a densely populated borough, we don't have the luxury to give low-rise with lots of space. Anyway, thank you.
Could I ask a question, Kim, supplementary to that? Is, do you know, or could you find out and send via James into us as to the where the maintenance and management costs for Trellick lie in first, second, third or fourth quartile of maintenance costs and management costs within the borough?
Well, and I say this because I actually have a great affection for Trellick Tower. I think it's a wonderful building, and it's great that we have it in the borough. As far as the housing revenue account, which is where the Trellick Tower sits, it is an albatross. I mean, it really is, because the revenue that we generate from the Trellick Tower, it does not cover its maintenance costs. And the costs of maintaining the Trellick Tower are huge. It's a listed building. The recent refurbishment we did, literally, I think it was literally shortly, was in progress just before the Grenfell fire. The scaffolding alone cost us £2.5 million. Just to put the scaffolding up to deal with some of the attendant problems. And clearly, you've got a finite number of flats. We have, obviously, rental income, which is obviously very much controlled. £130 a week typically would be in the per flat in the Trellick Tower. So it is a very difficult building for us, but there are factors that relate why that is, and as I say, in the listing of the building and the type of construction and the height goes towards that cost.
Can I go to some other councillors? Greg, would you like to? Councillor Greg Hammond.
Thanks very much. And Greg Hammond, I represent Caulfield Ward, which is a very highly densely populated part of South Kensington with large numbers of townhouses broken up into flats and a few mansion blocks, which shows it can be done. And can I say thank you for your report, Andrew? It's an excellent read. I read it when it first came out. And I'm just wondering, first of all, about the research. Did you commission any original research for this, or were you compiling research from experts who'd done work on different aspects of this? And then secondly, can you say a bit more about health outcomes, particularly amongst the less well-off, and I'm talking about the non-super rich who live in the penthouse. Is there any kind of correlation between poor health outcomes and how high people live up the tall build up in the sky? I've heard there is, but I haven't actually read that research for myself, and I'd be interested if you found anything on that. Thank you.
With regard to Trellick Tower, I mean, who wouldn't want to live in a property designed by Ernest Goldfinger? Who wouldn't? You know, I mean, it's a marvellous example of the architecture of the period. But I think you actually answered in the way that I was going to respond, which is, these are expensive things to maintain, and it's not for everyone. Your choice. I'm not going to tell you what to build. But one Trellick Tower's nice. If there were 12, would that be a sensible thing for Kensington, Chelsea to have? That's, of course, down to yourself, your own decision. And we must talk about, and just to emphasise what our Planning Regeneration Committee's view was, I don't want to mix it up too much with mine, is their view was that well-managed tower blocks are possible, but that management costs the residents or the local authority, we would submit, more than if you switch to a alternate typology. So this is about costs in the long term. With regard to the original research, no, we compiled research that had already taken place, and as I said, as I alluded to earlier, this research is coming thick and fast now, and it is pointing to the fact that they are not the solution that they were sold as. With regard to the health outcomes, well, when you look at the typology of tall buildings is such that it rather does end up producing, unless they are well managed, flats and apartments that can be quite claustrophobic. And there is some research, and I'm sure we can supply that afterwards, to indicate the mental health outcomes that are associated with living in such cramped accommodation. And it's no It's no secret, I mean, this has been always, but that was particularly drawn into consideration during the pandemic and the lockdown. I am very, very fortunate. I live in a 4-bedroom house. I've got lots of spare rooms, and I've got a tiny little garden out the back. And for me, the lockdown was like one long holiday. That is not the experience of many, many, many Londoners who had to spend those months in one room because that's all they had. These are things that you have to take into account. I think you have to take into account when you're considering your local plan. It's not just how can I put this? Tower blocks are a great place for you to look down on other Londoners. That's what you want to do. But remember, that's not the experience of everyone. And those particularly, as I said earlier, those people on the housing waiting list, social housing tenants, people in particular housing need, really don't get a choice. And if the only options is a tower block, that's where they go. They really can't say, I'd much rather have a terraced house, or I'd much rather live in a mansion block. That's not, they can't do that. So their families, the families they bring up, and the parents have little choice but to bring those families up in often very cramped conditions. It's going to have an effect on the outcomes for those young people in later life. I mean, it's not quite the investigation we're talking about now, but we've also done considerable work into overcrowding. In fact, we're entering into a new piece of research to update that data on overcrowding, and there is still 350,000 young people being brought up in overcrowded conditions in London. And we know from evidence provided by people like Shelter that has a very serious has very serious outcomes for young people growing into older life. No room to do their homework, no place to sort of go out and get the air, no place to call their own. That's another investigation, doesn't relate to typologies, but we know from what is built that that's the kind of accommodation that these young people will have to put up with. But just to go back to the previous point, yes, it is possible to design these. If you've got enough money, you can design anything. But if you haven't got the money, you have to take what you're given.
Could I pick up on one connection I'd like to make? I'm going to be very careful how I phrase this, because I can't tell an officer how to take on board advice. But can I ask that James Diamond, you make sure that Jonathan Wade has got the contacts he needs with Andrew Boff to receive, if he wishes, the research that's been mentioned by Andrew Boff, because I would hope that our officers had access to all the latest and best information when they're giving advice to their lead members and those who make policy in the leadership team.
If I can resolve your dilemma, if I just send it to him without being asked, then
that would be excellent. We can offer it, and then officers can do the right thing in the right protocol in relationship to the leadership team. I'm trying to avoid scrutiny getting involved in any protocol that it should not. Because I'm sure there's a governance officer around here who's about to wrap my knuckles in a minute. But I'd just like to make sure that line of communication is over. Tom, at the back, Councillor Tom Bennett.
Yeah, thanks very much, Andrew. It's an excellent report and also the speech tonight. I have two questions. One is on the sort of political side. So I think Kim made the very valid point that in a borough like ours, we've got, and I completely sort of agree with the findings of your report, but in a borough like ours, we have a very small amount of land and we have housing targets to hit. even though you can get great density with mansion blocks, on a very small amount of land you can get even more density with the tower block. So when we have those targets, it does make life difficult for us. And if we say, well, we're already very dense in Kensington, Chelsea, so targets shouldn't really apply to us and they should just build elsewhere, then everyone will say, well, you're NIMBYs. So how do we sort of counteract that political argument? That's the first question. Second question is, I wonder, did the committee have an opinion on existing tower blocks? Because some of the arguments about newer tower blocks still apply, and maybe apply even more so in terms of the cost of management, the health outcomes, the aesthetic. But then some of the arguments around carbon footprint don't apply so much because they've already been built, and knocking them down has obviously an impact on carbon emissions. So did the committee have an opinion about what we do about existing tower blocks, particularly sort of low-income residential? Thank you.
We didn't have a view in this investigation about the management of those tower blocks. That was not something as part of our report, though I think from the anecdote I gave you earlier, local authorities are struggling to try and find the right accommodation for those people in housing need on their waiting lists. Saying that local authorities are choosing to put families into tower blocks is a little I wouldn't support that view. They have no choice. They have no choice, like the resident has no choice, like even people who are buying homes, when they look at what's available to them and the costs of those homes, they have little choice because of what the housing stock that's around them. With regard to taking on, we do need an argument with government about how those targets are, how those targets come to be. There are local authorities with quite high densities that have been able to squeeze very large numbers of homes out of their existing of the available land. But I do need to, government should stop really telling us what they aspire to in terms of targets, and just start having an argument about what's possible. And in an already densely populated and very dense population that is in the Royal Borough, nobody thinks you're going to be able to achieve those. Even if you did build tower blocks, you would not be able to achieve those. So it's no solution to the problem that we have for housing in London. But yes, we do need to do something very strongly on a political basis to persuade the government, and we have an opportunity at the moment. Of course, Michael Gove is currently looking at planning legislation. He's looking at he's looking particularly at the implications of living in flats, shall we say, and with regard to the cladding crisis. So there we may have a sympathetic ear towards saying, look, let's just build quality homes that are possible. Yes, sorry, please.
So could I ask you what might be seen as rather a superficial question, but it's done for a purpose. If you or I, or those here present, by tomorrow morning could solve London's housing, or particularly, just make it more personal, let's make it RBKC's housing waiting list, and just say we've got enough houses by tomorrow, we've solved the waiting list, there is no waiting list. How big would the waiting list be by Easter as a result of that? Would it be the same as it is now? Would it be still zero? Or would it be growing rapidly to the same as it is now?
That's the kind of question that nobody ever wants to answer, because you're quite right.
The reason I'm asking this is because personally I think that this is a false target, because if you make it easier to live in the centre of London, my children were brought up or our children, because my wife's in the audience, were brought up in this borough. I was brought up in this borough. We were very lucky. But lots of friends I met at university and so on who came from other parts of the UK, their children all want to come to London when they're young. And some of them don't stay and some of them do stay. And why do they want to come here? Because there are jobs here, because there are opportunities here. It's a very desirable place to come to, a major world city, for a whole number of reasons. And the demand, therefore, is almost never ending. And until we start creating the demand elsewhere, we'll be chasing our tail the whole time on a reducing size of patch to build houses.
I think you're right. Sometimes, in government we try to fight the market too much. We try to level down, dare I say that? But we try to fight the market. I know as fact that I will never be able to buy a home in Kensington and Chelsea. I will never be able to do that. And as Londoners, we just accept. We move to the areas and we go to the areas where we find it possible to live. And we've just got to understand that there are many opportunities for housing in London that do not involve living right in the middle. Wouldn't we? I would have loved to live in central London. I remember how delighted I was to move into a privately rented flat on Brick Lane many years ago. And I was so excited by the prospect, I didn't really pay much attention to the cockroaches. But it was, this is not a choice. This is an unrealistic choice. People have got to have the option somewhere. And it's why we say, why many people say that transport is a housing issue and housing is a transport issue. It's the communication around London that is so important. There is no God-given right to live anywhere in London, despite what the market says. I don't think, I'm being political probably here, and this is my opinion rather than the committee's, but I don't see why we should feel like you have to. Local authorities will help. Local authorities want a mixed population. They want to be able to provide social housing. And I'm a great fan of council housing, less keen on some of the inventions the government comes up with that look like ownership but actually aren't, in order to look like they're providing home ownership for people. We've just got to accept the realities of living in London, and there's no New Yorker reckons he can live in Manhattan. It's not a right, and nobody from any major city in the world thinks that they can live wherever they want to, irrespective of those costs. But we have caring local authorities who want that mixed group of people, who want to look after those in housing need. And you so rightly, to go back to what you first said, if you started to solve that problem as one borough, well, the problem would double, triple and quadruple in no time at all. You're absolutely right.
Councillor Maxwell, would you, please?
Thank you, Andrew. It's always good to hear from you. You're such an entertaining speaker and you've got so much great experience. It's really valuable. One thing I've been wondering about during the pandemic is I'm a sad person who goes to the office every day, and I do look around the city in London and these tall buildings which are pretty empty. And I wonder about, you've got pension funds which own these buildings, which are underutilised. Do you think maybe there should be a thought around better utilisation of the existing stock of buildings? So if office buildings are increasingly being empty, should more of these be converted into housing as opposed to building new tall buildings?
You've obviously bugged me, that's all I can say, because today we've been having a meeting, haven't we, Stephen, about an investigation that we're currently looking at, about which will touch on the number of empty properties. Though I have to exercise, I have to give you some warnings on this. It's often sold as being the solution, that we just need to use these empty properties. Both Boris Johnson and Sadiq Khan have commissioned work to find out what the nature of the problem was. And basically, it's a problem, curiously enough, that affects the Royal Borough particularly badly, but for the rest of London, not so much. Now, I've got to qualify that by saying that we are just about to embark on that, and we've asked for more data to support that. But yes, there certainly are opportunities for providing homes in vacant properties, but there aren't as many as you think there are, unless you go down to Chelsea, in which there's loads, you know. And there aren't those huge opportunities, but they are there. And you know, watch this space. We'll be publishing a report in a few months about that, because the work is just underway.
I was wondering, were you talking about places in, like the City of London, for instance?
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking more, because I mean, recently I went off to the Barbican for performance of something, and nearby I was looking around, seeing all these office blocks, which obviously a lot of them are now sort of empty, and that's kind of what I was thinking.
Sorry, Max, I didn't, I missed that bit, sorry, yes. Well, obviously there are permitted development rights now, and so bearing in mind that it's much more profitable to provide homes rather than office space, it's kind of going to work its way through itself. The market is going to work its way through, and there are opportunities, I think, for local authorities perhaps to piggyback on such schemes in order to provide homes for affordable homes. I mean, it's not my ideal, and once again, the same applies. Those schemes will only really work if the management of those schemes works. Theoretically, it's possible to do that. We were talking about an area in Royal Docks, which is curiously enough where we're moving to as the London Assembly. We were talking about areas in Royal Docks where, again anecdotally, which is why we want to get the data, where a high percentage of those new developments down there appear to be empty. And of course there is the other challenge, specifically for yourselves, Westminster and Camden, is that of course a lot of those properties may be used for temporary accommodation and you know, temporary rent, holiday lets, things like that. And that again is a real challenge for yourselves and Westminster and Camden, and I think there's some other boroughs as well who've got it particularly bad. You do have powers to control that through local regulations, and that's something that boroughs should be looking at. Actually, I think the 90 days is a London-wide regulation, isn't it? Yeah. So no property can be let out on a temporary basis for more than 90 days. Then the poor old boroughs have got to enforce that, which just costs them more money.
Thank you. Councillor Chem Kamali, who's lead member for adult social care and health, and one of the things that I wanted to ask you actually, James, as to whether you feel that the comments that have been made about the research that's coming up about mental and physical well-being is something that you and your officers are considering as well. But sorry, I put that amongst your question.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, I think it is something we should be looking at, because frankly, your environment is such a key component of your mental well-being and your physical health. You know, and I think it'd be interesting to look at how much is sort of based upon your actual home and how much is based on your access to sort of good services locally, good parks, beautiful parks around, leisure facilities and the like. So yes, I'm happy to look at that, and probably in partnership with some of my colleagues here tonight. My question was really around sort of the Assembly's view on the future of London, given what we've seen over COVID and people having moved out of the borough. We've already seen locally sort of falling roll numbers on schools, ever more expensive to raise a family in central London, and it sort of Councillor Hammond's point on converted homes in South Kensington, of course they were built as single-family units which have been converted. And my question is really, with a population that, excluding migration, is sort of not replenishing itself on the whole, what are we thinking is really the sort of the upper limit of where London will actually reach? You know, we can continue to suck people in from across the country, as Will mentioned, but surely at some point we'll find that actually the effects of COVID will be here to stay, and perhaps we won't be needing such high demand in the very centre of London, but we'll actually need more housing in sort of work from home range where you can commute in once or twice a week, something like that. So I was just wondering what your thinking is in the wider piece. Thanks.
Incidentally, I've just received a text about some anecdotes that are worthwhile with regard to the mental health of people living in tower blocks, and I'll forward that on to the committee. Yes, what's going to happen to London? Well, all I do know is that not what's predicted, because it never has. But we have to prepare for that. We did a survey, the London Assembly did an original survey, and I'm checking with Stephen now to make sure this is about people's intentions, and this was just after the first lockdown, about what their plans were for the future. And I think it was something like 20%, if not more, of those people surveyed said they were now looking for moving out of the centre of London in order to, because of their experience of COVID and the realisation that they actually did need a larger space. It's a bit of a get out to say I don't know what the future of London is, but we have to plan for eventualities. But what I do know is that good quality housing never goes out of fashion. And the important thing is that we can't emphasise enough, and this is the committee speaking, about if you're going to put in a building of a tall building, it's got to be of really good design and really good management. Ironically, Tower Hamlets, I think, is now considering a tower block, a 55-storey tower block with only one lift, with only one stairwell. I'm astonished that we're even thinking of that. But the pressures are going to increase on London. We know that we've got a number of, despite the usual levels of immigration into London, we've got Hong Kongers coming over, we have to accommodate Afghan refugees, and we have to accommodate many refugees from different parts of the world. We have to accommodate people who are moving here for business. It's always going to be a churn, and it's always going to be a challenge. But the best thing we can do is make sure that what the homes are there, well designed, well managed. And it becomes much easier to manage a mansion block or a terraced house. Actually, there's no management at all in a terraced house. But much easier to manage terraced houses, mansion blocks, than it is to manage those tall tower blocks. I mean, I've just seen, personally, I've just seen too many of them, and too many horrible stories about how people feel trapped, despite the fact that they get a good view.
Anybody else like to ask a question? Sorry, Malcolm Spaulding, Councillor Malcolm Spaulding.
Thank you, Chairman. Andrew, thank you for your work on this, which is hugely appreciated in this borough. In Earl's Court, I'm faced with a development site that could have 5, 10, 20 tower blocks on it. And it worries me that this is an outmoded form of housing for many of the reasons that you've actually pinpointed. I remember as a child visiting an uncle's farm where he had chicken battery farming, and being horrified as a child to see the state of those chickens. And legislation has prevented that kind of thing. We're getting better at this with animals, but I don't see that we're getting better at this with human beings. I'd be very interested to see what the data is on especially mental health. I would also be very interested to see if there's any kind of sociological data actually asking the people who live in these high-rise tower blocks about something in depth about their perceptions of their life. Because outside the tower blocks, I can tell you they are universally execrated. People do not appreciate them architecturally. They don't appreciate them as part of the cityscape. They certainly don't appreciate them as part of the architecture of this borough, which is mostly conservation, high standard. The Victorians got it right. They got the density right. They got the green squares right. They got the sanitation right. The Great Exhibition was such a wonderful thing, and that's this borough's great gift to the world. And we do not want to accept the world's gift of high rise, because there's plenty of that in what was called the Third World. There's plenty of it in places like Hammersmith and Fulham and Croydon, but not in this borough, for me anyway. And I wonder if the public perception outside the tower blocks is that they are dreadful and nobody wants them. That's a universal experience on the doorstep in this borough. So I just wonder, how does that compare with the data from people who actually live in them? Do they have the same perception, or is this just something that is they've learnt to live with?
I think that's a very good question, because, as I say, this is the start of a journey on tower blocks, and we need more and more data. What I do know is that not many people ask those residents what they feel. It's not often asked. When it has been asked, it supports the view that I've given you, which is, generally speaking, the closer you are with everyone else, the only relationship you have with your neighbour is that you cause noise for them or whatever. If that's your relationship with the people around you, then it's not going to be a great one. And that, going back to the management point, this is about how well managed those buildings are, and it costs a lot of money. I mean, talking of management, I remember when I was the leader of Hillingdon Council about 1,000 years ago, and the housing officer came to me, the chief exec for housing came to me, and he said, we've got a problem with the tenancy. And I said, why are you coming to me to talk about a problem with the tenancy? He said, well, in a block in Hayes and Harlington, in Hayes town, which was, I think, 14-storey block, we've got a problem with somebody owning a pet. And I thought, why are you bothering me? This is a management issue. I mean, where do they live? They live on the 14th story. And I said, well, why are you bothering me with this? And they said, well, the pet is a horse. And residents were keeping this horse in their flat and squeezing it into a lift every day to go and feed on the common in the grass of the common areas. There's a whole lot of regulations that one broke, I can tell you. I've never heard it before. But it does emphasise, this is perhaps it's in extremis, but these management issues, you've got to be prepared for management issues. And that's why you're building in your problems for the future, unless you deal with management as urgency. And as I say, the easiest thing is to not have the management issues at all. Build a typology that minimises the amount of costs for residents, because those costs can be extreme, as we all know now. Those costs can be extreme, but also for the neighbours as well, because you're so right. If you've got a lovely view, that's lovely, that's really nice. But remember, other Londoners have to look at you, and that's the problem, is that they have to, London is starting to look like, a dentist's worst nightmare of teeth up and down. The horizon is developed into this broken vista of ill-planned tower blocks. And even if, not the committee's view, my view, even though there have been protections in the London plan before for tall buildings, for quite a while there's been protection saying that you shouldn't generally have a tall building unless there is a master plan or unless there is neighbouring buildings are high, and you've taken some of that in some of your proposals, I believe, to make sure that it's the heights are in keeping with neighbours. The fact is, if these are big developments, they're going to be called in by the mayor, and the mayor is only too happy to ignore his own plan. Only too happy in order to hit those numbers. And this is why I say it's like going back to the 60s, because it's all about these numbers that people are then able to sell to their residents, saying, look how many homes we built. Well, homes can sometimes be a loose description of what they've built.
Can I bring in one question from outside this room, again from Councillor Doris Schmetling? The question is, why do developers, be they private or public sector developers, avoid building big flats in tower blocks, 3-4 bedroom flats?
There's a glib answer, because they can get away with it. Why do they avoid building the bigger flats?
Bigger flats with balconies and all the things you need.
Again, I'm trying not to stray too far from our committee view, but suffice it to say that we've identified that the incentives are such that if you're building a tower block, you've already decided to build a tower block, it becomes much more profitable for every single story that you put on top of it. You'll build up to what the local authority feels is the limit, and then you'll try for a couple more. And I don't blame developers. Everybody's got to make a living. But it's the messages and the strength of the strength of the local authority in determining what they should be doing. Already in the London plan, they have been improving space standards back from the previous mayor. I believe those are still incorporated into the London plan, because I think that's something that would be very difficult for the mayor to argue, because we've seen too many examples prior to that instruction of tiny properties being built which are no good for a good life. But it's fundamentally, it's financial reasons. Developers will develop up to the limit of what you say they can develop, and if you just set those limits, they'll be more than happy. They'll have to rework the figures.
Okay. Thank you. Councillor Addenbrooke.
Thank you. You've talked about research into mental health and well-being, and also the importance of management. So I just wondered, has there been any research into crime in tower blocks, and in particular ASB?
The research tends to concentrate those that tends to be about, unless I get a text from my research very quickly, which I'm not going to get. The research tends to be about overcrowded properties, and that definitely has a correlation. There definitely is that, and there's research out there to support that. But bearing in mind that those are the kind of properties that are being built in offered in tower plots tend to be ones that lead to overcrowding. You could say there is a direct correlation, but I have no independent data linking crime to that typology. The only independent data I have is knocking on so many doors and realising so many poorly managed tower blocks are susceptible to people coming in, smoking crack cocaine in the stairwells, making a mess of the lifts. We're quite familiar with that, if they're not well managed. If they are well managed, that's fine, but ultimately the residents have to pay for that.
Thank you. Michael Barr.
Thank you very much. one of the main features of the pipeline of tall buildings is that 80% of it is housing. And the amount of housing tied up in unimplemented planning permissions just for those tower blocks is something in the region of 100,000. But one of the features is only a small proportion of it is affordable housing. And by that I mean really affordable housing rather than 80% of market rent. So most of the controls, if we don't like the output, are within the planning system. All the tests, whether it's life cycle, greenhouse gas emissions, whether it's open space, play space, all of these things can be tackled. And the real question is how effective are planners in negotiating for the type of housing that we want.
The skill, you have good planners in Royal Borough. I know that to be the case, compared to some other boroughs I won't mention. But certainly they're a very professional body here. I think this is about asserting the controls that we have, and persuading and that's why this London Plan development is critical, not just the next couple of years. Plans should be have their eye on 50 years in the future, as far as I'm concerned. I think actually the figure is 30, isn't it? Which I think is far too short. They should have a view for 50 years in the future as to what they're developing, but the planners have to take their lead from what the elected members have said is what they want. So that's established. So your other point, I
think I was saying there's evolving evidence, as you indicated, that some of the things that we hadn't previously considered in making planning decisions can now be brought into play, and it's really a question of how well we use the tools and evidence that we have.
Yes, and I think that's why I'm here. That's what I want to say, is that our research, our evidence sessions, I won't call it research because it's other people's research, but it's our evidence sessions. My aim is that can be used by councillors to make the best possible decision for their residents, and to defend residents against inappropriate development that they might not want to see in that area. As to what that development is entirely down to the councillors and the local plan that is in conformity with the London Plan. I just have seen too many planning committees where the officer's advice is you can't oppose this because it'll end up in an appeal and you'll end up with a worse development after all. And it's almost like blackmail sometimes. Not here, may I say, but I've seen it on other committees, and residents feel powerless, councillors feel powerless, even though there's a consensus of how they want their areas to look. They just feel as though they're bullied into supporting schemes that virtually no members are. I mean, I've known some developments go through where not a single member of planning committee thought it was a good idea. Not a single member. But they've just been told you have to do it, because you don't have the evidence to be able to fight it. The aim of this investigation is to give you a little bit of evidence in order to do that. It's not the complete solution. We need more data. We need more evidence about the importance of good design. But hopefully this will give you something with which you can fight this. And I've had very positive responses across London from all parties.
Thank you, Andrew. Are there any other questions from the floor? I don't have any others from outside. Johnny, is there anything you wanted to say at all?
No, just to thank Andrew for coming. It's been an enormously useful presentation, I think, and the work that the GLA is doing on these subjects is very important. Tall buildings, as we've heard today, is a big issue in Kensington and Chelsea, and protecting the heritage and the built environment that we do have is one of the things that I know members across this chamber care most deeply about.
Well, thank you very much, and as I say, thank you for inviting me. I really do appreciate it. I'm going to be telling Tony Devonish that I was here. I realise I've just admitted saying that I've come to talk to you. He's going to get upset about that. But we are, you know, we're from the GLA. We're here to help. How often, how often have you held that? Thank you very much.
I've just received a question. Max Schwan. Sorry. Into the last.
Well, thank you, Andrew. Very interesting and entertaining presentation, especially in the last few minutes. I just wanted to follow up what Councillor Hammond and Councillor Kamali touched upon, and that was health. There's little published data or research between building and health. So how does the Planning and Regeneration Committee get that data? Is this personal interest of mine?
Bearing in mind it's officers that get it for us, can I come back to you on that?
That'd be very helpful, thank
because
you.
I'm only too happy to get those sources for you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'd love to say it was all me, but it's clearly not the case. Thank you.
For everybody, as I said earlier on, James Diamond, put your hand up if you could, please, over there, will act as a helper to make sure the information gets put out, and we'll put the sources we're able to put them on some form of the website that will supplement the webcast tonight as well. So those who are not here tonight will have access to it as well. But I'll leave the officers up to work out how to do that.
Thank you.
It remains to me to say, I think on behalf of all of us here, and I know many councillors who are participating from outside, but also those who will be watching it over the next couple of days because they've had other meetings tonight and they haven't been able to come. And I'm sorry we haven't had a room full for you because of COVID, but I think you've heard some of the strong interest through the questions and so on. So thank you very much indeed for coming to Kensington and Chelsea. Much appreciated, and we would like to stay in touch with the continuation of your work. And if as councillors, as residents and in the borough plus the officers as well, we can contribute to your work in sharing expertise without taking any particular sides on this matter. At least we can raise the level of the debate. I think that's probably the essential thing, so that if we do anything in any direction, make decisions for any particular reason, it's done to the highest possible standard in full cognizance of the cost in every sense of those decisions that we make. So thank you very, very much for tonight. And if everybody could join me in and that brings us to the end of our proceedings. So if the officers could switch off the web stream, that would be most appreciated. Thank you very much indeed. And thank you to everybody for coming from outside.